will not have English or French easily, but the first vulgarity of the subtitles is my name. So that is my real name. I am not Yvon Bonenfant. Bonenfant. The artificial intelligence is monolingual. It's not bilingual. So thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here to speak about materiality and exchange. And I have a Canadian accent, so I will try to speak slowly and with clear consonants. I want to take you inside thinking of the voice as a vibratory material sculpture. So I'm going to take you through a series of concepts, and then I'm going to show you some artworks that I've attempted to make derived from these concepts. The first is Konstantinos Thomaidis' work about the voice as a means of rethinking thinking and a means of rethinking logic. So I added, after the keynote this morning, the link with Barad's work, because he actually is inspired by Barad's notions of entanglements a great deal. But essentially, he draws from Adriana Cavarero's philosophy of vocabulary, a philosophy that understands the voice as that which gives vitality to spoken text, that which gives also contingency to spoken text. Cavarero understands the voice and the use of the voice as a space where the feminine principle of knowledge-making can appear and complement the hardened facts of the ossification of written language in the history of Western philosophy. So for Cavarero, vocality and vocal exchange are a space where not just the ideational content, but also the emotions and the bodies engaging with the content of language signal themselves. So, from that point of view, Thomaidis asserts that the voice doesn't happen here, and it doesn't happen in your ears. It happens in between. It's an object that happens in between us. If that is true, we can also consider the voice in the light of Nina San-Eitzheim's work. Eitzheim is a musicologist who abandoned teaching classical singing through listening and began to teach it through the feeling of its vibrations in the body. She did this after attending the operas of Juliana Snapper. Juliana Snapper is a Californian contemporary music composer who has written a number of operas to be performed underwater in swimming pools. She sings into an amplification system that sends her vocal sound waves through the water of the swimming pools so that you experience the opera as something you feel on your skin rather than something you hear unless you dive underneath the water. Attending this opera, or the first opera by Snapper, Eitzheim came to the conclusion that she no longer needed to hear music. She needed to feel it in order to understand it as a material. And I'll come on to the link between her work and Van Elferen in a moment. A third concept. These concepts aren't in chronological order. That's very vocalic. A third concept that I'll refer to is Stephen Connor's concept of the vocalic body. And that concept is quite simple in a way. It's that when we hear something we think is a human voice, we see an imaginary body. That is to say, if you think the sound of something is human derived, you imagine a body to go with it. He developed this work from understanding ventriloquism. The important thing to know about this concept is his extended notion of the vocalic field. So for Connor, I make a sound, that sound leaves my body, and it's dead once it leaves my body. It's not alive anymore, like air. And it travels through space, and as it is traveling through space, it is a sensory field that collides with other bodies and objects. Van Elfering wouldn't agree with him. She would say that the vibration makes the vocalic field alive. But if we are talking about the voice that's taking place between my body and your ears, it is that field, le champ de la voix, that creates that space for your ears and my voice to encounter each other. So now we can go back to Isabella van Elfering and her ideas about timbre, the texture, the quality of the voice, and what timbre is and the sensuality it evokes. In both French and English, the word timbre is used to describe what makes identical sounds different from one another when they are identical in tone and note. So this is one timbre, ah, and this is another, ah. They are the same note, they are different timbres. Van Elfering thinks of timbre as tactile, woven texture, as the equivalent of textile or fabric or haptic engagement with sound. Simultaneously to Van Elfering thinking this way about sound, the voice scientists, Kreiman and Sintis, raise really interesting questions about timbre and how we identify different voices. We know that the average human can differentiate between 3,000 voices in their lifetime, but they can only identify about 10. That is to say that we are much better at telling voices apart than we are at mapping voices onto people directly in blind studies. Isn't that interesting? And nobody knows why yet. Nobody knows why. The assertion of Sintis and Kreiman is that this is because we learn to map voices onto images of bodies very, very young, and we learn to do it in a way that is almost stereotypical. So what do I mean by that? There are three very dense concepts here. So I'll go through them one by one. One of the things that their science shows is that when babies hear voices, babies map those voices onto the first face they see that goes with the voice within less than a second, and then they have a very difficult time changing that mapping. So if a baby, for example, sees a ventriloquist dummy do a voice, they will have a terrible time imagining that that voice comes from a human afterward. We seem to have a neurological tendency to freeze voices and bodies and the images of bodies together in our minds, and then really struggle when those things change. In my vocal training, at a certain point, I was able to speak like this suddenly in my vocal training. And I decided I would do that at work to see what happened. People did not like it. They were very used to my other voice, but I can speak in this voice in a very relaxed way. Many of my colleagues just said, "It's not you, it's not you." That's what I call the multisensory vocal identity. And alongside of that fact is the fact that we also largely in studies think that we can identify characteristics in voices, but we're actually much worse at it than we think we are. We think we can identify both straight men and gay men, think they can identify homosexuality in the male voice, but without a visual image, neither community has better than 50% guessing accuracy from the voice. But if you ask both of those communities, can you tell if he's gay from the way he talks? Both communities say 70% yes. But they're actually only 50% good at it, both communities. This is interesting. If with many vocal characteristics, we project identity onto them rather than understand it, and then we consider ourselves to be right. So in studies, in neurological studies, people think they can hear age, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, body size, and a number of other physical characteristics. The only ones we are sort of good at identifying really are sort of gender, but it's unclear whether or not that's because of cultural performance of gender. Because in many cultures, women are trained, people assigned as women are trained to speak higher than their natural vocal tone. So it's not clear that that's anything biological. And a little bit kilograms. Body size, a little bit. We're slightly better than normal at going, that voice is coming from a big body, or that voice is, and that's it. The rest of it is fantasy. So we actually project vocal identity on the identities we hear. And the image I often use to illustrate this is, have you ever had a crush or fallen in love with a voice where you have not seen the body, and then when you see the body, you get a surprise? Either way. Yeah. So you've invented an identity, a visual identity to go with the body. Secondly, there's a way that the voice can be used as an intensive interaction tool. I'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment, but because you'll see examples of it when I talk about the artwork. But we can also ask the question that if this field of voice happens between me and you, what happens when we shrink the space? What does it mean to shrink the space? And that's something that I've really experienced with people with complex disability. And thirdly, if voice is something that we manufacture and create, can we not actually find ways to sculpt and fashion it and style it in ways that give us a fantasy of ourselves, so that we can project and manufacture our own identities, not only with visual imagery, but with our vocalic bodies. Finally, I'll talk about the notion of the queer voice. I wrote an article in 2010 which suddenly started being read in 2017. Nobody read it until 2017. And now it's cited. I'm so excited I wrote something and people read it. It's very exciting. And now it's a cited article. And this article discusses why and how it is that we might recognize bodies, if we are in bodies that culture says are bodies of difference, in my case, a queered body, how we might recognize other queered bodies through the dim of straight space, should we be seeking to have pleasure exchange with people who are like us. And I asserted that we may be using the feelings, the different kinds of tactile feelings that come from vocal materiality to find touches that give us pleasure. And that once we find those touches, we seek to get in further contact with them. Voice is thus, according to Virginie Magnan, a kind of a goo, a material. Goo is a wonderful English word that has no translation. A kind of slime, a kind of bodily secretion that is pulpy, that binds us together. For while I'm producing the sound and you're hearing it, I'm feeling myself make the sound, and you are feeling me, or feeling what you think I am sending you. So we're having an exchange of tactile engagement. So I'm going to quickly show you quick samples of two artwork frameworks that try to play with these concepts. The first one is loop love. In loop love, it is called loop love because I went into schools for people with mild to moderate learning disability and tried to find out what kinds of vocal sounds gave them pleasure and plenitude to make if they were not told they had to sound beautiful, but rather were told they could make sounds that made them feel good. Here are some of the sounds they made. Sorry, you got two samples there. There are quite a lot of animals. They like animals. And through doing a series of workshops encouraging people to move away from singing songs well, but making sounds that made them feel interesting, we discovered they also loved to record themselves making these sounds and have an automated recording come back and play back their sounds, layering them on top of one another. They created sorts of beats. These sound excerpts you heard are each loops that we're repeating on our artwork while people were using the pilot artwork. We learned very interesting things about how they like to look at each other, how they like to touch or not touch each other, whether they like to make eye contact or not, and developed a sculptural interface that would try to celebrate and visually aesthetize the aesthetic refinement of the vocalic production that they were reaching for. Oops, sorry. Stop. I have to just wait for it to stop. We're all playing at once. Here is, whoops. Here is a little bit of the final product of Loop Love. You can see the sculptural object that people are using there, and you can look on my website if you're interested after the presentation more at how people produce work with this object and its sculptural characteristics. This artwork was inside of 10 different facilities over 27 weeks and was used 3 times a week with a facilitator who helped people engage with its potential. I will then move to another concept that I will just introduce before I finish, and that's the notion of the opposite of trauma. If that previous sculpture that you saw was all about, if that previous sculpture was all about bringing people inside a space where their aesthetic production of vocality and its haptic qualities were physically celebrated, then we really need to start asking the question, what kind of art can we make that allowed people to move that celebration from a space of celebration to a space of full transformation. Here you see an excerpt from a video of a project that I made in 2007 called The Opposite of Trauma. In this project, we explored, this ensemble and myself explored how vocal sensations might become movements that go into public space, and that might also embody a kind of anti-trauma or not trauma, a state of body and mind that moves beyond recovery or healing or even celebration, but that marks the body, the witnesses and the participants as strongly and as forcefully, positively, in the way trauma does negatively. So, in this pilot project many years ago, I don't know if it's going to act, it's not going to let me play, but in this pilot project many years ago, the ensemble actually engaged with developing these sensations inside their bodies that they thought were anti-traumatic. And at the moment, I'm working with all queer choir, where we are playing with vocal sounds and really trying to find the sensation of not trauma, of the opposite of trauma in our bodies, make sounds from them, and bring them to wider general publics. One of the components that we use, that's an earlier project that I was doing with children with complex and intersecting disability, but one of the tools we use to do this are our material voice dramatization orbs. I don't call them that to the audience. But what those do is they take your vocal frequencies, translate them through a vibration transducer, map them down onto the tactile sphere, and when you grab or hug the sphere, you can feel the vibrational qualities of your voice exaggerated on the frequency scale of the skin nerves, so that you can hold it, caress it, grapple it. Young children lick them quite often. They'll grab them and lick them. So we have sterilization. And that is in an attempt to bring more of an awareness of the haptic nature of that vocality to our users. So, in the end, what is this work trying to do, and what is my presentation trying to do? It's trying to invite you who, in this world, who are often thinking about visual material, sculptural material, spatial material, and performative material, to consider the voice as a sculptural phenomenon that you might also play with from a material perspective, to come into material relationship. Because in my view, if we can play with these opposite of traumatic spaces from a vocalic point of view, and these opposite of traumatic sensations, and if we can then use the art framework to bring them into people's spaces of fantasy and imagination, so that they can engage with the fantasy of there being a space where vocality gives them and marks them with the opposite of trauma, we're doing a little bit of social acupuncture. Giving people a tiny moment, and that the social acupuncture comes from a Canadian artist and actually from the company. I'm sorry I haven't cited him, but I will send you the reference afterwards. The notion that we can give people these tiny moments of sensation that open doors to other ways of imagining the future, a future that's not only not traumatic, but that is actively anti-traumatic, and that uses the body, our own human body and relationship, to find those particular spaces. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Yvon. I have your voice. Thank you so much. Preguntas. Yo sí. Thank you, Paul. I was funny enough, I was playing with that machine a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, was it already?
Yeah. Yes. Maybe what I'm going to ask, it is not a question, it's more of a comment that I was thinking about, especially at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about the recognition, the mapping of voice into a body. And because I grew up in this country, and we had dubbing in TV. And I remember my horror when I went to the UK and JR from Dallas didn't have the voice of, someone else, or Clint Eastwood, and I still, every time I hear it in dubbing, or the way I associated that certain voice with a character on TV, and then you heard them on the radio advertising, I don't know, whatever, beer. And it's just really made me think about that. I mean, it's just a thought, but I thought it was really interesting. You put it into context. Yeah.
It is a neurological phenomenon. And we don't know why we do it, but it makes life particularly hard for some people. Trans people who are trying to do vocal modification really struggle with critique around their voices and tend to have a lot of questions around whether their voice sounds enough like the identity that they want to have and what that means. Yet, strangely, if you do a certain kind of voice work with a group full of people assigned women at birth, they usually, a good proportion of them, for example, can sing as low as most men. But they're not trained or invited to sing as low as most men. So those suppositions of identity and vocal mapping create a framework that can be very rigid when it comes to identity. And that's one example of it. I think also many people here, we're in Catalonia, so many people here are at least bilingual, and many are trilingual or quadrilingual, and many people will also have their different vocal personality in a different language. So people often tell me, you sound so nice in French. And then I think, I must sound really mean in English. So there are also very interesting phenomena around vocal identity and who we think we are, who we think we're listening to. Yeah.
What about we don't like our own voices?
Yes. Do you want to know why you don't like your own voice? There is a scientific explanation, and then there's a cultural explanation. So the scientific explanation is that when we hear our own voices, we hear it through the bones of our skull. The bones of our skull only select a small number of the frequencies in our voices, and they vibrate to those frequencies, and that's what our eardrums pick up. So when we hear a recording of our voices, we're often shocked because we hear a very different set of frequencies than we do inside our own heads. Also, however, the best sound recording, right now, the best digital sound recording, picks up something like 18% of the human voice's content in terms of its harmonic richness. So when you listen to a recording of yourself, not only is it not what you hear through your ear, but also it is like looking at a black and white slide of a color cinema. You're listening to only some of your vocal frequencies in a sound recording and not all of them. So this is why the neuroscientists are very interested in how we can still identify voices from recordings, since they're such weak representations of voices. Yeah. So many people have that dysphoria where they hear their voices and think, that's not me, I don't like that. But it's also cultural. Because it's very interesting to ask that question culturally. And I worked in the UK, accent and class are very embedded in voice. Some people really struggle with how they think their voices represent their social class, or don't, or betray it, for example.
I also like to speak without microphone.
Hi! We're here.
Usually when I get a microphone, I'm asked to drop it because I
understand you, I understand.
No, I wanted to make, I don't know, a follow-up comment, question, I don't know. Maybe ask you to elaborate on that idea of how, because I was thinking about that, projecting identity and a body to a voice, and I was thinking about this movie by Luke's writing called Sorry to Bother You. I don't know if you...
I don't know.
It's very interesting because it's a black guy who works in a call center, and then he just discovers that the key to going up in the chain of the company is doing white voice.
Mm-hmm.
So you made me, I mean, you get kind of a shape to this idea that not only voice it's kind of a projection of an identity that we give to a certain person behind the voice, but also how that identity that we project has a lot of levels of oppression, of discrimination, of privilege. Could you elaborate a bit on that, on how through your work that is also kind of manifest in that kind of
I'm sure. I'll say two things about that. One is that race is one of the very clear categories where if you take accent and dialect out of a voice, people cannot accurately identify race. It's not surprising because race is a cultural construct, right? But still, you will hear in popular culture, oh, well, she sings like she's got a black voice. It's all lies. So there have been very, very in-depth studies in the United States that if you take words out of someone's voice, you absolutely can't identify any racial characteristics at all. So not only is the racialized voice used to oppress people, it's totally fake. A fake thing is used to oppress people. What is not fake is that people have accent and dialect, right? And accent and dialect are used as class and social status bearers all the time. Even in sexual orientation, obviously. I was told as a child that I had a very gay voice from a very young age. I didn't know what that meant, but I learned that in North American dialects, it's the way you say the letter S. There are all kinds of little things that people think are gayer than not gay. In fact, what science shows is that you speak like whoever was around you when you were a child. So if you grow up in a family with 10 sisters, you speak like your 10 sisters. Or 10 brothers, you speak like your 10 brothers. There's no relation to identity other than having a kind of family dialect or family accent. This is why, when I talk about the identity projection, it's so interesting how much we impregnate the voice with suppositions about status and identity. On the other hand, the second thing I want to say is that because we impregnate the voice with all of these things, this is a space where we can play with that identity. Because it's so full of suppositions about identity, we can give people opportunities to undo or redo or explore the other types of identity they could have. And much of my other artwork that I haven't presented here has been about trying to invite different kinds of publics to see what happens when they change their voice. Because we, who are technically trained, I'm technically trained in extended voice. That means I can do all kinds of weird sounds. All kinds of things like that without harming my voice. And blood-curdling screams. Yes, I won't do one now. But I really enjoy how when I make those sounds, people can't identify me Or they say, I don't know what kind of person was making that sound. We all have that option, and it's very interesting to bring people the option of redesigning their own voices and feeling the pleasure of what else their voices can do. So voice is no longer a prison, it's a series of potentials. That's why I'm using the word sculptural, because clay or any other material that we fashion could be thought of as vocal vibration, or vocal vibration could be thought of in the same way.
I don't know if you can hear me.
I can,
Yeah.
but maybe you want the mic for other people?
Yes. Is it better? Firstly, thank you so much for your speech. I'm like fascinated by your research, and I wish it was longer. But my question is, how did the notion of trauma come into your research? And like, where did it come from? Like from voice and materiality? And how did trauma appear? And how did the notion of the opposite of trauma appear?
Thank you for asking that. I come from the world of experimental music theater, and we have had a lot to do with the world of live and performance art in our time. And extended voice has an enormous amount to do with that. There is a body of work mostly by incredible female extended vocalists that really explores the forbidden sounds of culture. So, for example, Diamante Galas, an incredible extended vocalist, works with representing the sounds of the deeply traumatized in her work, and has done so for ages. So partly we have a long history of exploring the vocally forbidden, and one aspect of the vocally forbidden is that we are forbidden from acting like we are being traumatized with our voices. So by culture, so we are expected to be very reasonable after being hurt, injured, oppressed, etc., etc., etc. And many of the extended vocalists theorize about or suggest that that is to stop us from taking pleasure in at least being able to react with our voices to the phenomenon of trauma. So we talk about trauma a lot in extended voice. However, because we have links to the live art world, I've also seen the fashion for self-harm come in and out of live and performance art for years and years. Because of course it's been going on since the Austrian Actionists, or even before. And one of the really interesting things about making difficult vocal sounds is that if you harm yourself, you can't make them again. So you have to learn to make these sounds in a way that leaves your voice unbelievably healthy. And that raises really interesting questions about the representation of trauma to publics, and what it means to represent trauma. And of course, in queer performance, there's a very long history of trying to either represent or communicate or make space for people to talk about or about the traumatic. So that work is all really important, but at a certain point, I started feeling like a part of the art world was fetishizing the traumatic. And we're using the traumatic to titillate and to fascinate rather than to ask difficult questions. This is my personal view, right? So it's not that that work is wrong, but I became very interested in the whole notion that we don't even have a word for the not traumatic in French or English. It's like a forbidden concept, the anti-traumatic. Never mind a sound, we don't have a word. So I got really interested in working with these marginalized populations, and I brought up this slide because this is a different project called Resonant Tales. These are children with complex and intersecting disability. They are the most vulnerable people I've ever been around. They usually don't have spoken language. often they can't move themselves. So all day, other people are moving them and changing them and feeding them. And the level of vulnerability to possible abuse in these bodies is extreme because they can't defend themselves. They can't tell the story of if someone were to harm them, etc., etc. But man can they voice without words. And working with these marginalized populations, this hyper-marginalized demographic, I started really asking the question of how do we give them something that is not textual, that doesn't have language, but that allows them to go beyond celebration into some kind of total ecstasy of their body, like of what they've got. And that's where the initial notions of thinking about the opposites of trauma came from. I think there's lots of really good art about trauma. So it's not, I don't have to make more. I can see what else there is to do. Thank you for asking, because that's often a question that people don't ask, because we don't know how to talk about not trauma. Because we have no vocabulary. Is there a word in Spanish or Catalan that's the opposite of trauma? No. There isn't. Yeah. We have to, in our PR material, we have to call it anti-trauma, which doesn't work. Anti-trauma is wrong.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was also very much inspired for everything that you said. I also would like that it will go on longer, so thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between voice and dead. I'm going to explain a bit.
Voice and?
The dead.
And the dead.
Yeah, I was actually explaining a bit of this in my classes this week to some of my students who are here. So I actually thought that maybe they could, I don't know, maybe learn from something that you could amplify of that. So I did my thesis on a queer archive here in Barcelona that is around the 70s, and I ended up doing research and links with some archive of the late 19th century, also in Catalonia, which is the history of the mediums, the women who were able to transport through their own bodies the voices of the spirits. And it's very funny because I can show you later if you want some pictures, but I saw that thing that you said about thinking of the voice as a sculpture. In the case of these histories, is quite literal, because some of these mediums were able to create this ectoplasm, which is like this glue that you were saying, right? Once the voice came through their body. So yeah, I was just wondering, because I think for the queer community, it's very I think the relationship with the dead and the spiritual is quite present, so I was curious if you enter that realm of the connection between death and voice.
Thank you for asking. My PhD thesis was subtitled From the Living to the Dead. I haven't consciously been thinking about the dead in my work for quite a long time. But I think there is something about the traveling of the vocalic field that evokes in our imaginations what I would call in French l'au-delà, the beyond, the beyond. Whether that's the dead, or whether that's another space, or whether that's other living people, is interesting. There is such a long tradition of women taking up cultural roles in European space, especially European cultural space. Women taking up cultural roles where they were inventing or being vocal mediators for other worlds. Ireland has a tradition of keening, where there was actually a specific tradition of female singing that was extinguished by the British because it was considered so confrontational to the colonial power that it was extinguished, actively extinguished. You might not know that all Irish traditional music was banned for about 50 years. So people secretly kept playing music and things inside their houses. The keening tradition took place at funerals. Women led the mourning, the process of day or mourning through making these sounds that were extreme sounds, in quotation marks. So we have to ask this really interesting question of, because women were also constructed as low status, that these types of sounds were low status sounds. We need them, but they're low status. People that talk to the dead, we want them around, but they're low status. As long as they stay under our control, they're fine. It's very complex. It's also useful to note in the history of when radio was invented, people thought that it was the dead speaking through the radio. They couldn't believe that it was recordings of living beings. And soon, in roughly 3 years, everybody, you will be able, this is a school of design, and art design, you will be able to pay an AI to design a voice for you in English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Korean, or Japanese. And you will be able to give it bodily characteristics and use it to read work for you. So you will be designing an entity that you will probably relate to as if it were alive. So there's the question of the dead who've died, but there's also the question of the dead who've never lived. AI. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I also really share the fascination towards everything you've been sharing. And I'm very interested in this that you were mentioning about healing. I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between voice and, sorry, can I speak louder?
No, I can't hear. I'm just moving to be more cozy.
Oh, okay.
It's weird to stand up for a second.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the relationship between voice and liquidity, water, and I'm thinking about healing also as a practice of mourning that is really related to crying as well. No? So it's like the putting into circulation of this liquid. And I was really fascinated about your description of voice as this sort of goo, or like this sort of liquid that also like resonates within like some solid realm, because as you were mentioning, the bones also act as the resonators for this voice to be heard. So I don't really have a solid question, but I guess also I guess this materiality, this active quality of voice also makes me think of its relationship with like a sort of ecology, no? So you were talking about like the voice interacting with the space, it resonates with its objects, but also not only with human ears, but with other, beings that might receive this voice. I don't know, I was wondering if you have anything to say in relation to this.
I can say two things, but one of them for you as an artist is something you could just play with. So if you know tomorrow there's a workshop on the use of Arduinos, if you know somebody who's an Arduino coder or a Raspberry Pi coder and who likes doing that kind of thing, or if you are one yourself, you could use quite simple code to hook up a microphone to a Raspberry Pi and then hook up a waterproof mobile phone transducer to the other end of the Arduino and drop it in water. Voice through it, use the code, stick your finger in the water and feel what it feels like. There are also, those orbs have something called a puck transducer in them. They're beautiful in solids. I've used them on plywood, styrofoam, when we're doing R&D, sheet metal, because then the sheet metal goes like this too. Sheets of polycarbonate mirror, so the mirror also, you get a visual effect when it vibrates. They were designed for using under cinema seats in IMAX theaters, so that you go in a rocket ship and you would feel in your ass, essentially. You would feel like, but because they were designed to transmit such thick experience, you can really get a nice thick experience from them. And tactile experience. And Juliana Scamper has whole speaker systems that she's designed for going in pools. So it's possible to play with this as an artist. Just play with it, and see where it goes. The second thing I would say in response to your comments is I have my own fantasies. I've tried for about 8 years in different ways to get a huge amount of money, wasteful money, and I haven't succeeded yet, but I'm going to before I die. I will succeed. Someone will do this. To collaborate with a vibration engineer who works in the UK, because my fantasy is that we will have a bathtub that you can get into with a kind of gooey liquid, and you could take a bath in your own voice or other people's voices. And my other fantasy is that you could roll in voice fur. So you'd have a fur that's voice responsive. But these things are coming. They'll be possible in certain ways relatively soon. I haven't made the kinds of logical arguments that funders need to get me hard. So I should say that it's for Apple or something, like the next mobile phone technology. And then the last comment you made was about, what was your last comment? It was a bit different. You were asking about water.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I guess there's a certain relationship between healing and ecology.
Yeah. Oh, yes, you were talking
yeah.
about other animals. Animals. There is amazing science on other animals and voices. Not such great science on whether they and how they perceive human voices, but except with dogs, there's tons of research. Like people are trying to figure out if dogs can understand humans and human language, and some primates as well. But the world of animal sound production is particularly interesting. And there are people that specialize in it, and there's all kinds of interesting research. Look at emperor penguins. They are unbelievable. How they communicate through sound is really, really interesting. They have 2 voice boxes. They have 2 bird voice boxes, which are called pharynxes. And those 2 voice boxes sound simultaneously. And they make sound that's so close together that it makes a beat pattern. If you know frequencies of sound, that makes sense. If you don't, it doesn't. But essentially, they'll make sounds this close together. That close together, or even closer. And in 500 emperor penguins, the babies can recognize their parents' pattern and they can hear them from the outside and waddle into the middle and find their parents from the 2 colliding sounds that the penguins are making. So the world of the acoustics of the animal and plant world is super interesting. In terms of how our voices actually affect them, very little is known so far. Yeah, but many animals respond very strongly to vibration in different ways. Voice nerd.